It began in silence. Not the silence of peace, but the eerie stillness that comes before a storm, the kind that makes men uneasy, even when there's no enemy in sight. The Ardennes forest, stretching across Belgium and Luxembourg, was supposed to be quiet that December of 1944. American troops who had fought from Normandy through France now occupied what was called a ghost front, a place to rest, reorganize, and recover from months of brutal combat. Snow blanketed the pine trees, fires crackled in dugouts, soldiers exchanged holiday wishes, talked about home, and believed, if only for a fleeting moment, that the war might soon be over. Private First Class Charles Chuck Harper of the 106th Infantry Division wrote in his journal on December 15th, "Feels like winter back home, cold enough to hurt your bones. The Krauts are quiet. Maybe they're finished. God, I hope they're finished." What Harper didn't know was that just beyond those trees, hidden under the forest canopy and camouflaged roads, more than 200,000 German soldiers were waiting. Tanks, artillery, field trucks, and thousands of men stood ready for what would become Hitler's last great gamble, a counteroffensive meant to split the Allied lines, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16th, the stillness shattered. The horizon erupted with thunder. German artillery, more than 1,500 guns strong, opened fire on the unsuspecting Americans. Trees exploded into splinters, earth shook. Men stumbled from their foxholes in disbelief. It was as if hell itself opened up, Sergeant Paul Dillard remembered. The sky flashed red, the ground shook under our feet, and suddenly our radios went dead. Hitler called it Wacht am Rhein, the watch on the Rhine. But for the Americans, it would be remembered simply as the Battle of the Bulge. Within hours, chaos swept through the front lines. Units like the 106th, 99th, and 28th Divisions were hit first, overwhelmed by waves of German armor and infantry. The famed 1st SS Panzer Division, led by fanatical officers loyal to the Nazi regime, plowed through villages with speed and brutality. Entire towns, St. Vith, Clairvaux, and others, were swallowed in the onslaught. Roads clogged with refugees and retreating vehicles. Command posts lost contact with their men. The ghost front was now a battlefield. In the confusion, stories of heroism and despair unfolded everywhere. In one small Belgian village, a company of American engineers held off a German armored column with nothing but rifles, mines, and a few bazookas. They came out of the mist, Corporal Sanders recalled. Tanks first, infantry behind. We fired until our barrels glowed red. When the bazooka rounds were gone, we threw grenades. When the grenades were gone, we threw rocks. Farther north, Lieutenant John Eisenhower, son of General Dwight Eisenhower, was serving as an intelligence officer. Reports began flooding in. Entire divisions missing, bridges blown, German paratroopers spotted behind the lines. Rumors spread that the enemy was wearing stolen American uniforms, speaking perfect English, giving false orders. And some of those rumors were true. Otto Skorzeny's Kampfgruppe X had infiltrated American lines disguised as GIs, sowing confusion wherever they went, changing road signs, misdirecting traffic, cutting communication lines. Panic rippled through the rear areas as MPs began stopping every soldier, demanding passwords, asking baseball trivia questions to catch imposters. Meanwhile, General Dwight D. Eisenhower at SHAEF headquarters in France faced the most shocking development of the entire war. His intelligence officers had dismissed earlier warnings, assuming the Germans no longer had the manpower or fuel to launch a major offensive. Now, within a single morning, the front had collapsed across a 50-mile stretch. Eisenhower gathered his senior commanders, Bradley, Patton, and others. "This is their last gasp," he told them grimly. "We'll fight it here, and we'll break them once and for all." Back on the ground, ordinary soldiers bore the brunt of that decision.
Private Harper and his platoon tried to hold their line near Schönberg, but were soon surrounded. For 3 days they fought without sleep or food, pinned down by relentless shell fire. On the 4th day, with ammunition gone and casualties mounting, they were captured, marched eastward into Germany through snow and ice, joining thousands of new POWs. Harper wrote one final line in his notebook before the Germans took it. "If anyone finds this, tell my mother I did my best." Elsewhere, resistance stiffened. American commanders threw everything they had into the defense. The 101st Airborne Division, already battle-hardened from Normandy and Holland, was rushed to the small Belgian town of Bastogne, a key road junction. Their orders were simple: hold the town at all costs. As the 101st dug in, the weather turned worse. Heavy snow grounded Allied aircraft, leaving troops isolated and freezing. Supplies dwindled. Men wrapped themselves in blankets, huddled around candles, and prayed. The Germans surrounded Bastogne completely, cutting off all routes. On December 22nd, German envoys approached under a white flag, carrying a message demanding surrender. The note promised annihilation if the Americans refused. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st, read the letter and laughed. His one-word reply became legend: nuts. The message baffled the Germans, but electrified the Americans. It became a rallying cry. "We're still here," McAuliffe told his men. "We've got no intention of leaving." In foxholes and ruins, soldiers sang carols on Christmas Eve, their voices mixing with distant gunfire. It wasn't about orders anymore, Sergeant Dillard later said. It was about not letting the guy next to you down. Behind the lines, General George S. Patton was already moving. Known for his aggression and brilliance, Patton had predicted such a counterattack weeks before. Now he turned his entire Third Army north, an impossible maneuver, through frozen roads and wrecked terrain. "We're going to relieve Bastogne, and we're going to do it in 48 hours. Men of Patton's armored divisions pushed through blizzards, clearing mines and battling ambushes. Chaplains prayed for a break in the weather. On December 23rd, it came. The clouds lifted, and Allied aircraft roared back into the skies. P-47 Thunderbolts and C-47 transports dropped supplies, ammunition, and food into Bastogne, parachutes blossoming against the snow. The tide began to turn. Yet for every victory, there was tragedy. Near Malmedy, a group of 84 American soldiers were massacred by SS troops under Joachim Peiper's command. News of the atrocity spread quickly, hardening the resolve of every man still fighting. "No one was thinking about politics anymore," Lieutenant Frank Carver recalled. "We were fighting for each other, for the guys who didn't make it." As the year drew to a close, the German advance stalled. Their fuel was running out, their supply lines stretched thin. What had begun as Hitler's last gamble was turning into a disaster. But the cost for the Allies was immense. Tens of thousands dead, wounded, or missing. Villages lay in ruins. The Ardennes was a frozen graveyard. By early January, Patton's forces had linked up with the 101st in Bastogne, breaking the siege. Soldiers embraced in the snow, exhausted but unbroken. The German dream of splitting the Allied front was over, but the battle wasn't done yet. Pockets of fighting continued as the Americans pushed the enemy back toward the Rhine. General Eisenhower wrote in his diary, "The Germans have spent their last reserves. The end is now inevitable. But at what price?" The men who survived would never forget the Ardennes, the cold, the fear, the comrades lost. For them, it wasn't just another battle. It was the moment they realized that victory would come not from strategy or machines, but from endurance, the will to keep fighting when everything seemed lost. Private Harper's notebook was later found in a snowdrift outside St. Vith, its final page smeared with ice and dirt. Someone had added a single line beneath his last words. He did.
The forest groaned under the weight of snow, and every gust of wind carried the whisper of artillery. Bastogne, a small Belgian town that no one outside the Ardennes had heard of before December 1944, had become the beating heart of a battle that would decide the fate of the Western Front. Inside its frozen perimeter, the men of the 101st Airborne Division and elements of the 10th Armored fought not only the enemy, but also the elements, hunger, and exhaustion. The world had moved on from the beaches of Normandy and the liberation of Paris, but here, surrounded and forgotten by most of the world, the U.S. Army was making its last stand. Corporal Henry "Hank" Ellis remembered the first night after Bastogne was encircled. He said, "You could hear tanks moving out there. You'd think the snow would muffle the sound, but it didn't. It carried it. Every rumble meant they were closer." The men had no winter clothing. Many still wore thin uniforms from the fall campaigns. Food was scarce. Ammunition was running low. And when the snow came in thick sheets, it blinded the artillery spotters and froze the gun oils solid. Every piece of equipment had to be warmed by hand. Our rifles jammed, our boots froze, Ellis said, but we stayed. The first days of January 1945 dawned with bitter cold and a sky the color of gunmetal. The forest was silent again, but it was not the same silence that had preceded the German attack weeks earlier. This was the silence of exhaustion, of death, of ground reclaimed at too great a price. The Battle of the Bulge was not yet over, but the tide had turned. The Germans were falling back, their dream of splitting the Allied front reduced to wreckage scattered across the snow. And now it was the Americans' turn to strike back. General George S. Patton stood outside his command post in Luxembourg, his coat dusted with snow, watching his tanks rumble north. His Third Army had performed a miracle, pivoting from east to north, cutting through blizzards and chaos to reach Bastogne. But Patton was not a man to rest on success. He wanted to destroy the enemy completely. "We're not just relieving Bastogne," he told his officers. "We're going to chase those bastards all the way to the Rhine." The plan was brutal in its simplicity. Attack from the south while the 1st and 9th Armies pushed from the north, closing the Bulge like a fist. The Germans, trapped between them, would be crushed. But the terrain and the weather remained merciless. The roads were sheets of ice. The forests were dense, filled with wrecked vehicles, dead men, and mines hidden beneath snowdrifts. It wasn't a battlefield anymore, one GI said later. It was a frozen nightmare. In the shattered remains of villages like Hafelize, Foy, and Manhay, the fighting was hand-to-hand, house-to-house. The Germans were desperate now. Their tanks, once symbols of invincibility, were bogged down and fuel-starved. Crews abandoned them and fought as infantry. Many were young, boys of 16 or 17 conscripted into the Wehrmacht's last divisions. The Americans pitied them, but did not hesitate. "They were kids," said Sergeant Jim Carter of the 2nd Armored Division, "but they were still shooting at us, and when it's you or them, you stop thinking about age." The counteroffensive was relentless. Patton's men advanced through snow up to their knees, their uniforms stiff with frost. Supplies struggled to keep up. Rations were frozen solid. Soldiers thawed coffee with gun barrels. Every step forward felt like a small eternity. You didn't know if the guy next to you would still be there tomorrow. You just kept moving. From the air, the change was dramatic. The once overcast skies now belonged to the Allies again. Squadrons of P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoons swooped down on retreating German columns, turning roads into infernos. Pilots reported columns stretching for miles. Tanks, trucks, horse-drawn wagons, all trying to flee eastward. It was slaughter, one pilot recalled grimly.
They couldn't move, and we came down again and again until there was nothing left moving. For the men on the ground, the destruction was both terrifying and liberating. The smell of burned rubber and fuel filled the valley, said Private Daniel Knox. We knew the tide had turned. You could feel it in your bones. The Germans were retreating not in formation, but in chaos, abandoning equipment, vehicles, and wounded comrades. Their dream of breaking the Allied line had died in the snowdrifts of the Ardennes. In the town of Foy, near Bastogne, paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division launched a counterattack of their own. The town had changed hands several times, each battle leaving it more shattered. On January 13th, Easy Company, the same men who had held Bastogne, advanced through the open fields under sniper fire. We moved in bursts, recalled one paratrooper. You could hear the bullets cracking past your head. The snow turned pink. When they reached the outskirts, they found German soldiers frozen in their foxholes, weapons still clutched in their hands. The battle for Foy ended in silence. Nearby, medics worked without rest. The wounded came in a steady stream, carried on stretchers improvised from doors and blankets. Morphine was scarce. Bandages were made from torn uniforms. It was the same story everywhere, said Nurse Margaret Wood, attached to a mobile evacuation unit. Frozen feet, shrapnel, burns. They were kids, and they never complained. By mid-January, Allied lines met near Hafelize, closing the Bulge. The German salient that had once thrust deep into Belgium was gone. But the victory came at a staggering cost. Over 80,000 American casualties, villages obliterated, entire forests flattened. The Ardennes, once a place of peace, had become a graveyard of metal and men. In the wreckage, stories of humanity still emerged. In one small hamlet, a group of American soldiers found a lone German medic tending to wounded, both his and theirs. He had a Red Cross armband and carried no weapon. He'd been working for days without rest. We could have taken him prisoner, but we didn't. We just nodded and he kept working. War makes enemies, but it doesn't always kill decency. The American counterattack pushed on. Patton's armor rolled forward, liberating towns that had been under German control for only days. In the north, British forces under Field Master Montgomery closed in from the top of the Bulge. By late January, the front line looked much like it had before December 16th. Hitler's grand gamble had failed utterly. But in his underground bunker in Berlin, he refused to accept it. "We will strike again," he told his generals. "We will throw them back." Yet everyone in that room knew the truth. The Reich was finished. For the soldiers who fought in the Ardennes, victory was hollow. "We didn't cheer," said Sergeant Carter. "We just counted who was left." Letters home were filled with names of the dead, friends lost in the forest, never found again. In the frozen fields, the last patrols moved through wreckage that seemed endless. Burnt tanks, twisted helmets, shattered rifles. Crows circled overhead, the only sound in the wind. In Bastogne, the townspeople emerged from cellars for the first time in weeks. The church bells rang weekly, echoing across the valley. The 101st Airborne raised their flag over the ruins, a symbol not of triumph, but of survival. "We held," said General McAuliffe simply. "That's all there is to say." The Battle of the Bulge ended officially on January 28, 1945. In the frozen quiet that followed, Allies took stock. They had won, yes, but at a cost greater than any battle the U.S. Army had ever fought. The Germans had lost irreplaceable men and machines. Their final reserves burned away in one desperate throw of the dice. The Western Front was broken open. The path to the Rhine was clear. But for the men who fought there, the scars were deeper than any map could show. They had seen comrades freeze to death beside them, watched towns burn to ash, and fought through a winter that seemed endless. They carried those memories home, long after the war ended. "The Ardennes never left me," said Private Knox decades later. "When it snows, I still hear the guns."
When the guns finally fell silent in the Ardennes, the world had changed. Europe was a continent of ghosts, and the snow-covered woods of Belgium and Luxembourg were filled with the remnants of war. Burned tanks, shattered helmets, and the unmarked graves of soldiers who would never see spring. The Battle of the Bulge had lasted 6 weeks, but its shadow stretched far longer. It was the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought by the United States Army, and it revealed both the best and worst of humanity under fire. In February 1945, Allied forces resumed their march eastward. The German army, shattered and demoralized, could no longer hold. The Ardennes offensive had drained its last reserves of fuel, manpower, and morale. "They threw everything they had at us," General Eisenhower said, "and we threw it back." Within months, the Allies would cross the Rhine, liberate concentration camps, and bring the war in Europe to its final, terrible conclusion. But for the men who survived the Bulge, victory brought no easy peace. Thousands carried frostbite injuries, nightmares, and the heavy silence of what they had seen. "I came home," Sergeant Carter said, "but part of me never left that forest." Veterans rarely spoke of Bastogne or Foy or Malmedy. The memories were too raw. It was easier to say, "We fought in the snow," and leave the rest unsaid. In Germany, the defeat marked the beginning of the end. Hitler's last gamble had failed, and his generals knew it. The Reich would fall within months. Yet even in defeat, there were lessons carved into the ice. The German soldiers who fought at the Bulge were not all fanatics. Many were boys, fighting for survival. American and German veterans who met years later often spoke not of hatred, but of shared suffering. "We froze on opposite sides of the same forest," one German veteran said. "The snow did not care whose side you were on." In the decades that followed, Bastogne became a place of pilgrimage. Veterans returned, sometimes with children or grandchildren, to stand among the trees where they had once fought. The town rebuilt itself from ruins, but reminders of the battle remained. Bullet holes in walls, rusted helmets unearthed by farmers, and quiet memorials scattered among the pines. On the anniversary of the battle, the people of Bastogne still honor the American soldiers who saved their town. They light candles, hang U.S. flags, and say, "Thank you for our freedom." General McAuliffe lived to see those anniversaries. When asked years later what he remembered most, he didn't talk about his famous nuts reply or the medals. He talked about the men. They were cold, hungry, and scared, but they stood fast. That's what I'll never forget. In Washington, new recruits studied the lessons of the Bulge. They learned that intelligence failures could be deadly, that even in modern war, courage and endurance mattered more than numbers. The battle became a case study in leadership and resilience. It showed that victory could emerge not from perfection, but from persistence, the stubborn refusal to break. For the world, the Battle of the Bulge was a turning point, not because it decided the war's outcome, but because it revealed the true character of the American soldier. Ordinary men, clerks, farmers, factory workers, had faced one of history's fiercest storms and held the line. Their courage broke the last illusion of Nazi strength and ensured that freedom would march forward, even through the snow. In the forests of the Ardennes, time has softened the scars. The trees have grown back, the fields bloom in spring. But beneath the soil lie traces of that terrible winter. Fragments of helmets, dog tags, rusted bullets. Each year, when the snow returns, it covers the land like a shroud, reminding those who walk there that once, long ago, the world's fate was decided in these quiet woods. The men who fought there have mostly passed now. Their voices are gone, their letters faded, but their legacy endures, not in monuments or medals, but in the silence they left behind, the silence of men who endured the unendurable. The Battle of the Bulge was their crucible, their defining hour, and though history has written its outcome, the true story lives in the memories of those who survived and in the gratitude of the generations that followed.
As one old veteran said, standing among the graves at Henry Chapelle Cemetery, "We didn't think about history back then, we just wanted to go home." But maybe that's what made it matter. We fought not for glory, but for each other. The snow fell softly around him, covering the marble crosses, the endless rows of names. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying echoes of gunfire long gone. And in that silence, you could almost hear them still, the men of the Ardennes, the ones who held the line when the world was falling apart.